however, by observing that, though we might by these means succeed in obtaining news from the moon, we could not possibly send any intelligence back in return, unless indeed the Solnits had at their disposal optical instruments at least as good as ours. All agreed that this was very true, and, as is generally the case when one keeps all the talk to himself, the conversation now assumed so serious a turn that for some time it was hardly worth recording. At last the chief engineer, excited by some remark that had been made, observed with much earnestness, "You may say what you please, gentlemen, but I would willingly give my last dollar to know what has become of those brave men. Have they done anything? Have they seen anything? I hope they have. But I should dearly like to know." Ever so little success would warrant a repetition of the great experiment. The Columbiad is still to the good in Florida, as it will be for many a long day. There are millions of men today as curious as I am upon the subject. Therefore it will be only a question of mere powder and bullets if a cargo of visitors is not sent to the moon every time she passes our zenith. Marston would be one of the first of them, observed Brownson, lighting his cigar. "Oh, he would have plenty of company," cried the midshipman. "I should be delighted to go if he'd only take me." "No doubt you would, Mr. Midshipman," said Brownson. "The wise men, you know, are not all dead yet." "Nor the fools either, Lieutenant," growled old Frisbee, the fourth officer, getting tired of the conversation. "There is no question at all about it," observed another. "Every time a projectile started, it would take off as many as it could carry." "I wish it would only start often enough to improve the breed," growled old Frisbee. "I have no doubt whatever," added the chief engineer, "that the thing would get so fashionable at last that half the inhabitants of the earth would take a trip to the moon." "I should limit that privilege strictly to some of our friends in Washington," said old Frisbee, whose temper had been soured probably by a neglect to recognize his long services, "and most of them I should by all means insist on sending to the moon. Every month I would ram a whole raft of them into the Columbiad, with a charge under them strong enough to blow them all to the but. Hey, what in creation's that?" For a second only did they catch its flash. For a second only did they catch its flash. Whilst the officer was speaking, his companions had suddenly caught a sound in the air which reminded them immediately of the whistling scream of a Lancaster shell. At first they thought the steam was escaping somewhere, but, looking upwards, they saw that the strange noise proceeded from a ball of dazzling brightness, directly over their heads, and evidently falling towards them with tremendous velocity. Too frightened to say a word, they could only see that in its light the whole ship blazed like fireworks, and the whole sea glittered like a silver lake. Quicker than tongue can utter, or mind can conceive, it flashed before their eyes for a second, an enormous bolide set on fire by friction with the atmosphere, and gleaming in its white heat like a stream of molten iron gushing straight from the furnace. For a second only did they catch its flash before their eyes, then striking the bowsprit of the vessel, which it shivered into 1,000 pieces, it vanished in the sea in an instant with a hiss, a scream, and a roar, all equally indescribable. For some time the utmost confusion reigned on deck. With eyes too dazzled to see, ears still ringing with the frightful combination of unearthly sounds, faces splashed with floods of sea water, and noses stifled with clouds of scalding steam, the crew of the Susquehanna could hardly realize that their marvelous escape by a few feet from instant and certain destruction was an accomplished fact, not a frightful dream. They were still engaged in trying to open their eyes and to get the hot water out of their ears, when they suddenly heard the trumpet voice of Captain Bloomsbury crying, as he stood half-dressed on the head of the cabin stairs, "What's up, gentlemen? In heaven's name, what's up?" The little midshipman had been knocked flat by the concussion and stunned by the uproar. But before anybody else could reply, his voice was heard, clear and sharp, piercing the din like an arrow. "It's they, Captain. Didn't I tell you so?" Chapter XXI. News for Marston. In a few minutes, consciousness had restored order on board the Susquehanna, but the excitement was as great as ever. They had escaped by a hair's breadth the terrible fate of being both burned and drowned without a moment's warning, without a single soul being left alive to tell the fatal tale, but on this neither officer nor man appeared to bestow the slightest thought. They were wholly engrossed with the terrible catastrophe that had befallen the famous adventurers. What was the loss of the Susquehanna and all it contained, in comparison to the loss experienced by the world at large in the terrible tragic denouement just witnessed? The worst had now come to the worst. At last the long agony was over forever. Those three gallant men, who had not only conceived but had actually executed the grandest and most daring enterprise of ancient or modern times, had paid by the most fearful of deaths, for their sublime devotion to science and their unselfish desire to extend the bounds of human knowledge. Before such a reflection as this, all other considerations were at once reduced to proportions of the most absolute insignificance. But was the death of the adventurers so very certain after all? Hope is hard to kill. Consciousness had brought reflection, reflection doubt, and doubt had resuscitated hope. "It's they," had exclaimed the little midshipman, and the cry had thrilled every heart on board as with an electric shock. Everybody had instantly understood it. Everybody had felt it to be true. Nothing could be more certain than that the meteor which had just flashed before their eyes was the famous projectile of the Baltimore Gun Club. Nothing could be truer than that it contained the three world-renowned men and that it now lay in the black depths of the Pacific Ocean. But here opinions began to diverge. Some courageous breasts soon refused to accept the prevalent idea. "They're killed by the shock," cried the crowd. "Killed," exclaimed the hopeful ones. "Not a bit of it. The water here is deep enough to break a fall twice as great." "They're smothered for want of air," exclaimed the crowd. "Their stock may not be run out yet," was the ready reply. "Their air apparatus is still on hand." "They're burned to a cinder," shrieked the crowd. "They had not time to be burned," answered the band of hope. "The projectile did not get hot till it reached the atmosphere, through which it tore in a few seconds." If they are neither burned nor smothered nor killed by the shock, they are sure to be drowned, persisted the crowd, with redoubled lamentations. Fish 'em up first, cried the hopeful band. Come. Let's lose no time. Let's fish 'em up at once. The cries of hope prevailed. The unanimous opinion of a council of the officers hastily summoned together by the captain was to go to work and fish up the projectile with the least possible delay. But was such an operation possible? Asked a doubter. Yes, was the overwhelming reply. Difficult, no doubt, but still quite possible. Certainly, however, such an attempt was not immediately possible, as the Susquehanna had no machinery strong enough or suitable enough for a piece of work involving such a nicety of detailed operations, not to speak of its exceeding difficulty. The next unanimous decision, therefore, was to start the vessel at once for the nearest port, whence they could instantly telegraph the projectile's arrival to the Baltimore Gun Club. But what was the nearest port? A serious question, to answer which in a satisfactory manner the captain had to carefully examine his sailing charts. The neighboring shores of the California peninsula, low and sandy, were absolutely destitute of good harbors. San Diego, about a day's sail directly north, possessed an excellent harbor, but, not yet having telegraphic communication with the rest of the Union, it was of course not to be thought of. San Pedro Bay was too open to be approached in winter. The Santa Barbara Channel was liable to the same objection, not to mention the trouble often caused by kelp and wintry fogs. The Bay of San Luis Obispo was still worse in every respect, having no islands to act as a breakwater. Landing there in winter was often impossible. The harbor of the picturesque old town of Monterey was safe enough, but some uncertainty regarding sure telegraphic communications with San Francisco decided the council not to venture it. Half Moon Bay, a little to the north, would be just as risky, and in moments like the present when every minute was worth a day, no risk involving the slightest loss of time could be ventured. Evidently, therefore, the most advisable plan was to sail directly for the Bay of San Francisco, the Golden Gate, the finest harbor on the Pacific coast and one of the safest in the world. Here telegraphic communication with all parts of the Union was assured beyond a doubt. San Francisco, about 750 miles distant, the Susquehanna could probably make in 3 days, with a little increased pressure, possibly in 2 days and a half. The sooner then she started, the better. The fires were soon in full blast. The vessel could get under way at once. In fact, nothing delayed immediate departure but the consideration that 2 miles of sounding line were still to be hauled up from the ocean depths. Rudd the captain, after a moment's thought, unwilling that any more time should be lost, determined to cut it. Then marking its position by fastening its end to a buoy, he could haul it up at his leisure on his return. Besides, said he, the buoy will show us the precise spot where the projectile fell. As for that, Captain, observed Brownson, the exact spot has been carefully recorded already, 27 degrees 7 north latitude by 41 degrees 37 west longitude, reckoning from the meridian of Washington. "All right, Lieutenant," said the captain curtly. "Cut the line." A large cone-shaped metal buoy, strengthened still further by a couple of stout spars to which it was securely lashed, was soon rigged up on deck, whence, being hoisted overboard, the whole apparatus was carefully lowered to the surface of the sea. By means of a ring in the small end of the buoy, the latter was then solidly attached to the part of the sounding line that still remained in the water, and all possible precautions were taken to diminish the danger of friction, caused by the contrary currents, tidal waves, and the ordinary heaving swells of ocean. It was now a little after 3 o'clock in the morning. The chief engineer announced everything to be in perfect readiness for starting. The captain gave the signal, directing the pilot to steer straight for San Francisco, north-north by west. The waters under the stern began to boil and foam. The ship very soon felt and yielded to the power that animated her, and in a few minutes she was making at least 12 knots an hour. Her sailing powers were somewhat higher than this, but it was necessary to be careful in the neighborhood of such a dangerous coast as that of California. 750 miles of smooth waters presented no very difficult task to a fast traveler like the Susquehanna. Yet it was not till 2 days and a half afterwards that she sighted the Golden Gate. As usual, the coast was foggy, neither Point Lobos nor Point Bonita could be seen. But Captain Bloomsbury, well acquainted with every portion of this coast, ran as close along the southern shore as he dared, the fog gun at Point Bonita safely directing his course. Here expecting to be able to gain a few hours' time by signaling to the outer telegraph station on Point Lobos, he had caused to be painted on a sail in large black letters, "The Moonmen are back," but the officers in attendance, though their foghorn could be easily heard, the distance not being quite 2 miles, were unfortunately not able to see it. Perhaps they did see it, but feared a hoax. Giving the Fort Point a good wide berth, the Susquehanna found the fog gradually clearing away, and by 3:30 the passengers, looking under it, enjoyed the glorious view of the Contra Costa Mountains east of San Francisco, which had obtained for this entrance the famous and well-deserved appellation of the Golden Gate. In another half-hour, they had doubled Black Point, and were lying safely at anchor between the islands of Alcatraz and Yerba Buena. In less than 5 minutes afterwards the captain was quickly lowered into his gig, and 8 stout pairs of arms were pulling him rapidly to shore. The usual crowd of idlers had collected that evening on the summit of Telegraph Hill to enjoy the magnificent view, which for variety, extent, beauty and grandeur, is probably unsurpassed on earth. Of course, the inevitable reporter, hot after an item, was not absent. The Susquehanna had hardly crossed the bar, when they caught sight of her. A government vessel entering the bay at full speed, is something to look at even in San Francisco. Even during the war, it would be considered rather unusual. But they soon remarked that her bowsprit was completely broken off. Very unusual. Something decidedly is the matter. See. The vessel is hardly anchored when the captain leaves her and makes for Meg's Wharf at North Point as hard as ever his men can pull. Something must be the matter, and down the steep hill they all rush as fast as ever their legs can carry them to the landing at Meg's Wharf. The captain could hardly force his way through the dense throng, but he made no attempt whatever to gratify their ill-dissembled curiosity. "Carriage!" he cried, in a voice seldom heard outside the din of battle. In a moment 17 able-bodied cabmen were trying to tear him limb from limb. "To the telegraph office!" Like lightning, were his stifled mutterings, as he struggled in the arms of the Irish giant who had at last succeeded in securing him. "To the telegraph office!" cried most of the crowd, running after him like foxhounds, but the more knowing ones immediately began questioning the boatman in the captain's gig. These honest fellows, nothing loath to tell all that they knew and more that they invented, soon had the satisfaction of finding themselves the center point of a wonder-stricken audience, greedily swallowing up every item of the extraordinary news and still hungrily gaping for more. By this time, however, an important dispatch was flying east, bearing 4 different addresses: to the Secretary of the U.S. Navy, Washington; to Colonel Joseph Wilcox, Vice President Pro Tem, Baltimore Gun Club, M.D., to J.T. Marston, Esquire, Longs Peak, Grand County, Colorado, and to Professor Wenlock, Subdirector of the Cambridge Observatory, Mass. This dispatch read as follows: in latitude 27 degrees 7 minutes north and longitude 41 degrees 37 minutes west, shortly after 1 o'clock on the morning of 12th instant, Columbiad projectile fell in Pacific. Send instructions. Bloomsbury, Captain, Susquehanna. In 5 minutes more all San Francisco had the news. An hour later, the newspaper boys were shrieking it through the great cities of the states. Before bedtime every man, woman, and child in the country had heard it and gone into ecstasies over it. Owing to the difference in longitude, the people of Europe could not hear it till after midnight. But next morning the astounding issue of the great American enterprise fell on them like a thunderclap. We must, of course, decline all attempts at describing the effects of this most unexpected intelligence on the world at large. The Secretary of the Navy immediately telegraphed directions to the Susquehanna to keep a full head of steam up night and day so as to be ready to give instant execution to orders received at any moment. The observatory authorities at Cambridge held a special meeting that very evening, where, with all the serene calmness so characteristic of learned societies, they discussed the scientific points of the question in all its bearings. But, before committing themselves to any decided opinion, they unanimously resolved to wait for the development of further details. At the rooms of the Gun Club in Baltimore there was a terrible time. The kind reader no doubt remembers the nature of the dispatch sent one day previously by Professor Belfast from the Longs Peak Observatory, announcing that the projectile had been seen but that it had become the Moon's satellite, destined to revolve around her forever and ever till time should be no more. The reader is also kindly aware by this time that such dispatch was not supported by the slightest foundations in fact. The learned professor, in a moment of temporary cerebral excitation, to which even the greatest scientist is just as liable as the rest of us, had taken some little meteor or, still more probably, some little fly speck in the telescope for the projectile. The worst of it was that he had not only boldly proclaimed his alleged discovery to the world at large, but he had even explained all about it with the well-known easy pomposity that science sometimes ventures to assume. The consequences of all this may be readily guessed. The Baltimore Gun Club had split up immediately into two violently opposed parties. Those gentlemen who regularly conned the scientific magazines, took every word of the learned professor's dispatch for gospel, or rather for something of far higher value, and more strictly in accordance with the highly advanced scientific developments of the day. But the others, who never read anything but the daily papers and who could not bear the idea of losing Barbican, laughed the whole thing to scorn. Belfast, they said, had seen as much of the projectile as he had of the open polar sea, and the rest of the dispatch was mere twaddle, though asserted with all the sternness of a religious dogma and enveloped in the usual scientific slang. The meeting held in the clubhouse, 24 Monument Square, Baltimore, on the evening of the 13th, had been therefore disorderly in the highest degree. Long before the appointed hour, the great hall was densely packed and the greatest uproar prevailed. Vice President Wilcox took the chair, and all was comparatively quiet until Colonel Bloomsbury, the honorary secretary in Marston's absence, commenced to read Belfast's dispatch. Then the scene, according to the account given in the next day's Sun, from whose columns we condense our report, actually beggared description. Roars, yells, cheers, counter-cheers, clappings, hissings, stampings, squallings, whistlings, barkings, mewings, cock-crowings, all of the most fearful and demoniacal character, turned the immense hall into a regular pandemonium. In vain did President Wilcox fire off his detonating bell, with a report on ordinary occasions as loud as the roar of a small piece of ordnance. In the dreadful noise then prevailing it was no more heard than the fizz of a lucifer match. Some cries, however, made themselves occasionally heard in the pauses of the din. Read! Read! Dry up! Sit down! Give him an egg! Fair play! Hurrah for Barbican! Down with his enemies! Free speech! Belfast won't bite you. He'd like to bite Barbican, but his teeth aren't sharp enough. Barbican's a martyr to science, let's hear his fate. Martyr be hanged, the old man is to the good yet. Belfast is the grandest name in science. Groans for the grandest name. Awful groans. 3 cheers for old man Barbican. The exceptional strength alone of the walls saved the building from being blown out by an explosion in which at least 5,000 pairs of lungs participated. 3 cheers for M. Nicol and the Frenchman. This was followed by another burst of cheering so hearty, vigorous and long continued that the scientific party, or Belfasters as they were now called, seeing that further prolongation of the meet was perfectly useless, moved to adjourn. It was carried unanimously. President Wilcox left the chair. The meeting broke up in the wildest disorder, the scientists rather crestfallen, but the Barbican men quite jubilant for having been so successful in preventing the reading of that detested dispatch. Little sleeping was done that night in Baltimore, and less business next day. Even in the public schools so little work was done by the children that St. Wallace, Esquire, President of the Education Board, advised an anticipation of the usual Christmas recess by a week. Everyone talked of the projectile. Nothing was heard at the corners but discussions regarding its probable fate. All Baltimore was immediately rent into two parties, the Belfasters and the Barbicanites. The latter was the most enthusiastic and noisy, the former decidedly the most numerous and influential. Science, or rather pseudoscience, always exerts a mysterious attraction of an exceedingly powerful nature over the generality, that is, the more ignorant portion of the human race. Assert the most absurd nonsense, call it a scientific truth, and back it up with strange words which, like potentiality, etc., sound as if they had a meaning but in reality have none, and 9 out of every 10 men who read your book will believe you. Acquire a remarkable name in one branch of human knowledge, and presto! You are infallible in all. Who can contradict you, if you only wrap up your assertions in specious phrases that not one man in a million attempts to ascertain the real meaning of? We like so much to be saved the trouble of thinking, that it is far easier and more comfortable to be led than to contradict, to fall in quietly with the great flock of sheep that jump blindly after their leader than to remain apart, making oneself ridiculous by foolishly attempting to argue. Real argument, in fact, is very difficult, for several reasons. First, you must understand your subject well, which is hardly likely. Secondly, your opponent must also understand it well, which is even less likely. Thirdly, you must listen patiently to his arguments, which is still less likely. And fourthly, he must listen to yours, the least likely of all. If a quack advertises a panacea for all human ills at $1 a bottle, 100 will buy the bottle, for one that will try how many are killed by it. What would the investigator gain by charging the quack with murder? Nobody would believe him, because nobody would take the trouble to follow his arguments. His adversary, first in the field, had gained the popular ear, and remained the unassailable master of the situation. Our love of science rests upon our admiration of intellect, only unfortunately the intellect is too often that of other people, not our own. The very sound of Belfast's phrases, for instance, satellite lunar attraction, immutable path of its orbit etc., convinced the greater part of the intelligent community that he who used them so flippantly must be an exceedingly great man. Therefore, he had completely proved his case. Therefore, the great majority of the ladies and gentlemen that regularly attend the scientific lectures of the Peabody Institute, pronounced Barbican's fate and that of his companions to be sealed. Next morning's newspapers contained lengthy obituary notices of the great balloonatics, as the witty man of the New York Herald phrased it, some of which might be considered quite complimentary. These, all industriously copied into the evening papers, the people were carefully reading over again, some with honest regret, some deriving a great moral lesson from an attempt exceedingly reprehensible in every point of view, but most, we are sorry to acknowledge, with a feeling of ill-concealed pleasure. Had not they always said how it was to end? Was there anything more absurd ever conceived? Scientific men too. Hang such science! If you want a real scientific man, no windbag, no sham, take Belfast. He knows what he's talking about. No taking him in. Didn't he, by means of the monster telescope, see the projectile, as large as life, whirling round and round the moon? Anyway, what else could have happened? Wasn't it what anybody's common sense expected? Don't you remember a conversation we had with you one day? Etc., etc. The Barbicanites were very doleful, but they never thought of giving in. They would die sooner. When pressed for a scientific reply to a scientific argument, they denied that there was any argument to reply to. What? Had not Belfast seen the projectile? No. Was not the great telescope then good for anything? Yes, but not for everything. Did not Belfast know his business? No. Did they mean to say that he had seen nothing at all? Well, not exactly that, but those scientific gentlemen can seldom be trusted. In their rage for discovery, they make a mountain out of a molehill, or, what is worse, they start a theory and then distort facts to support it. Answers of this kind either led directly to a fight, or the Belfastists moved away thoroughly disgusted with the ignorance of their opponents, who could not see a chain of reasoning as bright as the noonday sun. Things were in this feverish state on the evening of the 14th, when, all at once, Bloomsbury's dispatch arrived in Baltimore. I need not say that it dropped like a spark in a keg of gunpowder. The first question all asked was, is it genuine or bogus? Real or got up by the stockbrokers? But a few flashes backwards and forwards over the wires soon settled that point. The stunning effects of the new blow were hardly over when the Barbicanites began to perceive that the wonderful intelligence was decidedly in their favor. Was it not a distinct contradiction of the whole story told by their opponents? If Barbican and his friends were lying at the bottom of the Pacific, they were certainly not circumgyrating around the moon. If it was the projectile that had broken off the bowsprit of the Susquehanna, it could not certainly be the projectile that Belfast had seen only the day previous doing the duty of a satellite. Did not the truth of one incident render the other an absolute impossibility? If Bloomsbury was right, was not Belfast an ass? Hurrah! The new revelation did not improve poor Barbican's fate a bit, no matter for that. Did not the party gain by it? What would the Belfasters say now? Would not they hold down their heads in confusion and disgrace? The Belfasters, with a versatility highly creditable to human nature, did nothing of the kind. Rapidly adopting the very line of tactics they had just been so severely censuring, they simply denied the whole thing. What? The truth of the Bloomsbury dispatch? Yes, every word of it. Had not Bloomsbury seen the projectile? No. Were not his eyes good for anything? Yes, but not for everything. Did not the captain know his business? No. Did they mean to say that the bowsprit of the Susquehanna had not been broken off? Well, not exactly that, but those naval gentlemen are not always to be trusted. After a pleasant little supper, they often see the wrong lighthouse, or, what is worse, in their desire to shield their negligence from censure, they dodge the blame by trying to show that the accident was unavoidable. The Susquehanna's bowsprit had been snapped off, in all probability, by some sudden squall, or, what was still more likely, some little aerolite had struck it and frightened the crew into fits. When answers of this kind did not lead to blows, the case was an exceptional one indeed. The contestants were so numerous and so excited that the police at last began to think of letting them fight it out without any interference. Marshal O'Kane, though ably assisted by his 12 officers and 500 patrolmen, had a terrible time of it. The most respectable men in Baltimore, with eyes blackened, noses bleeding, and collars torn, saw the inside of a prison that night for the first time in all their lives. Men that even the Great War had left the warmest of friends, now abused each other like fishwomen. The prison could not hold the half of those arrested. They were all, however, discharged next morning, for the simple reason that the mayor and the aldermen had been themselves engaged in so many pugilistic combats during the night that they were altogether disabled from attending to their magisterial duties next day. Our readers, however, may be quite assured that, even in the wildest whirl of the tremendous excitement around them, all the members of the Baltimore Gun Club did not lose their heads. In spite of the determined opposition of the Belfasters, who would not allow the Bloomsbury dispatch to be read at the special meeting called that evening, a few succeeded in adjourning to a committee room, where Joseph Wilcox, Esquire, presiding, our old friends Colonel Bloomsbury, Major Elphinstone, Tom Hunter, Bilsby the Brave, General Morgan, Chief Engineer John Murphy, and about as many more as were sufficient to form a quorum, declared themselves to be in regular session, and proceeded quietly to debate on the nature of Captain Bloomsbury's dispatch. Was it of a nature to justify immediate action or not? Decided unanimously in the affirmative. Why so? Because, whether actually true or untrue, the incident it announced was not impossible. Had it indeed announced the projectile to have fallen in California or in South America, there would have been good valid reasons to question its accuracy. But by taking into consideration the moon's distance, and the time elapsed between the moment of the start and that of the presumed fall, about 10 days, and also the Earth's revolution in the meantime, It was soon calculated that the point at which the projectile should strike our globe, if it struck it at all, would be somewhere about 27 degrees north latitude, and 42 degrees west longitude, the very identical spot given in the captain's dispatch. This certainly was a strong point in its favor, especially as there was positively nothing valid whatever to urge against it. A decided resolution was therefore immediately taken. Everything that man could do was to be done at once, in order to fish up their brave associates from the depths of the Pacific. That very night, in fact, whilst the streets of Baltimore were still resounding with the yells of contending Belfastists and Barbicanites, a committee of 4, Morgan, Hunter, Murphy, and Elphinstone, were speeding over the Alleghenies in a special train, placed at their disposal by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, and fast enough to land them in Chicago pretty early on the following evening. Here a fresh locomotive and a Pullman car taking charge of them, they were whirled off to Omaha, reaching that busy locality at about supper time on the evening of the 16th of December. The Pacific train, as it was called, though at that time running no further west than Julesburg, instead of waiting for the regular hour of starting, fired up that very night, and was soon pulling the famous Baltimore Club men up the slopes of the Nebraska at the rate of 40 miles an hour. They were awakened before light next morning by the guard, who told them that Julesburg, which they were just entering, was the last point so far reached by the rails. But their regret at this circumstance was most unexpectedly and joyfully interrupted by finding their hands warmly clasped and their names cheerily cried out by their old and beloved friend, J.T. Marston, the illustrious secretary of the Baltimore Gun Club. At the close of the first volume of our entertaining and veracious history, we left this most devoted friend and admirer of Barbican established firmly at his post on the summit of Long's Peak, beside the great telescope, watching the skies, night and day, for some traces of his departed friends. There, as the gracious reader will also remember, he had come a little too late to catch that sight of the projectile which Belfast had at first reported so confidently, but of which the professor by degrees had begun to entertain the most serious doubts. In these doubts, however, Marston, strange to say, would not permit himself for one moment to share. Belfast might shake his head as much as he pleased, he, Marston, was no fickle reed to be shaken by every wind. He firmly believed the projectile to be there before him, actually in sight, if he could only see it. All the long night of the 13th, and even for several hours of the 14th, he never quitted the telescope for a single instant. The midnight sky was in magnificent order, not a speck dimmed its azure of an intensely dark tint. The stars blazed out like fires, the moon refused none of her secrets to the scientists who were gazing at her so intently that night from the platform on the summit of Long's Peak. But no black spot crawling over her resplendent surface rewarded their eager gaze. Marston indeed would occasionally utter a joyful cry announcing some discovery, but in a moment after he was confessing with groans that it was all a false alarm. Towards morning, Belfast gave up in despair and went to take a sleep, but no sleep for Marston. Though he was now quite alone, the assistants having also retired, he kept on talking incessantly to himself, expressing the most unbounded confidence in the safety of his friends, and the absolute certainty of their return. It was not until some hours after the sun had risen and the moon had disappeared behind the snowy peaks of the west, that he at last withdrew his weary eye from the glass through which every image formed by the great reflector was to be viewed. The countenance he turned on Belfast, who had now come back, was rueful in the extreme. It was the image of grief and despair. "Did you see nothing whatever during the night, Professor?" he asked of Belfast, though he knew very well the answer he was to get. "Nothing whatever." "But you saw them once, didn't you?" "Them? Who?" "Our friends." "Oh. The projectile. Well, I think I must have made some oversight." "Don't say that. Did not Mr. M. Connell see it also?" "No. He only wrote out what I dictated." "Why, you must have seen it." "I have seen it myself." "You shall never see it again. It's shot off into space." "You're as wrong now as you thought you were right yesterday." "I'm sorry to say I was wrong yesterday, but I have every reason to believe I'm right today." "We shall see." "Wait till tonight." "Tonight? Too late. As far as the projectile is concerned, night is now no better than day." The learned professor was quite right, but in a way which he did not exactly expect. That very evening, after a weary day, apparently a month long, during which Marston sought in vain for a few hours' repose, just as all hands, well wrapped up in warm furs, were getting ready to assume their posts once more near the mouth of the gigantic telescope, Mr. M. Connell hastily presented himself with a dispatch for Belfast. The professor was listlessly breaking the envelope, when he uttered a sharp cry of surprise. "Hey!" cried Marston quickly. "What's up now?" "Oh! The projectile." "What of it?" "What? Oh, what? Speak." "It's back." Marston uttered a wild yell of mingled horror, surprise, and joy, jumped a little into the air, and then fell flat and motionless on the platform. Had Belfast shot him with a 10-pound weight, right between the two eyes, he could not have knocked him flatter or stiffer. Having neither slept all night, nor eaten all day, the poor fellow's system had become so weak that such unexpected news was really more than he could bear. Besides, as one of the Cambridge men of the party, a young medical student, remarked, the thin, cold air of these high mountains was extremely enervating. The astronomers, all exceedingly alarmed, did what they could to recover their friend from his fit, but it was nearly 10 minutes before they had the satisfaction of seeing his limbs moving with a slight quiver and his breast beginning to heave. At last the color came back to his face and his eyes opened. He stared around for a few seconds at his friends, evidently unconscious, but his senses were not long in returning. "Say," he uttered at last in a faint voice. "Well," replied Belfast. "Where is that infernal projectile. In the Pacific Ocean. What? He was on his feet in an instant. Say that again. In the Pacific Ocean. Hurrah! All right. Old Barbican's not made into mincemeat yet. No, sirree. Let's start. Where for? San Francisco. When? This instant. In the dark. We shall soon have the light of the moon. Curse her. It's the least she can do after all the trouble she has given us. Chapter XXII. On the Wings of the Wind. Leaving M. Connell and a few other Cambridge men to take charge of the great telescope, Marston and Belfast in little more than an hour after the receipt of the exciting dispatch, were scudding down the slopes of Long's Peak by the only possible route, the inclined railroad. This mode of traveling, however, highly satisfactory as far as it went, ceased altogether at the mountain foot, at the point where the Dale River formed a junction with Cache la Poudre Creek. But Marston, having already mapped out the whole journey with some care and forethought, was ready for almost every emergency. Instinctively feeling that the first act of the Baltimore Gun Club would be to send a committee to San Francisco to investigate matters, he had determined to meet this deputation on the route, and his only trouble now was to determine at what point he would be most likely to catch them. His great start, he knew perfectly well, could not put him more than a day in advance of them, they having the advantage of a railroad nearly all the way, whilst himself and Belfast could not help losing much time in struggling through ravines, canyons, mountain precipices, and densely tangled forests, not to mention the possibility of a brush or two with prowling Indians, before they could strike the line of the Pacific Railroad, along which he knew the club men to be approaching. After a few hours' rest at La Porte, a little settlement lately started in the valley, early in the morning they took the stage that passed through from Denver to Cheyenne, a town at that time hardly a year old but already flourishing, with a busy population of several thousand inhabitants. Losing not a moment at Cheyenne, where they arrived much sooner than they had anticipated, they took places in Wells, Fargo and Company's overland stage mail bound east, and were soon flying towards Julesburg at the rate of 12 miles an hour. Here Marston was anxious to meet the club men, as at this point the Pacific Railroad divided into two branches, one bearing north, the other south of the Great Salt Lake, and he feared they might take the wrong one. But he arrived in Julesburg fully 10 hours before the committee, so that himself and Belfast had not only ample time to rest a little after their rapid flight from Long's Peak, but also to make every possible preparation for the terrible journey of more than 1,500 miles that still lay before them. This journey, undertaken at a most unseasonable period of the year, and over one of the most terrible deserts in the world, would require a volume for itself. Constantly presenting the sharpest points of contrast between the most savage features of wild barbaric nature on the one hand, and the most touching traits of the sweetest humanity on the other. The story of our club men's adventures, if only well told, could hardly fail to be highly interesting. But instead of a volume, we can give it only a chapter, and that a short one. From Julesburg, the last station on the eastern end of the Pacific Railroad, to Cisco, the last station on its western end, the distance is probably about 1,500 miles, about as far as Constantinople is from London, or Moscow from Paris. This enormous stretch of country had to be traveled all the way by, at the best, a 6-horse stage tearing along night and day at a uniform rate, road or no road, of 10 miles an hour. But this was the least of the trouble. Bands of hostile Indians were a constant source of watchfulness and trouble, against which even a most liberal stock of rifles and revolvers were not always a reassurance. Whirlwinds of dust often overwhelmed the travelers so completely that they could hardly tell day from night, whilst blasts of icy chill, sweeping down from the snowy peaks of the Rocky Mountains, often made them imagine themselves in the midst of the horrors of an Arctic winter. The predominant scenery gave no pleasure to the eye or exhilaration to the mind. It was of the dreariest description. Days and days passed with hardly a house to be seen, or a tree or a blade of grass. I might even add, or a mountain or a river, for the one was too often a heap of agglomerated sand and clay cut into unsightly chasms by the rain, and the other generally degenerated into a mere stagnant swamp, its shallowness and dryness increasing regularly with its length. The only houses were log ranches, called relays, hardly visible in their sandy surroundings, and separate from each other by a mean distance of 10 miles. The only trees were either stunted cedars, so far apart as to be often denominated lone trees, and, besides wormwood, the only plant was the sage plant, about 2 feet high, grey, dry, crisp, and emitting a sharp pungent odor by no means pleasant. In fact, Barbicane and his companions had seen nothing drearier or savager in the dreariest and savagest of lunar landscapes than the scenes occasionally presented to Marston and his friends in their headlong journey on the track of the Great Pacific Railroad. Here, boulders, high, square, straight and plumb as an immense hotel, blocked up your way. There lay an endless level, flat as the palm of your hand, over which your eye might roam in vain in search of something green like a meadow, yellow like a cornfield, or black like plowed ground, a mere boundless waste of dirty white from the stunted wormwood, often rendered misty with the clouds of smarting alkali dust. Occasionally, however, this savage scenery decidedly changed its character. Now, a lovely glen would smile before our travelers, traversed by tinkling streams, waving with sweet grasses, dotted with little groves, alive with hares, antelopes, and even elks, but apparently never yet trodden by the foot of man. Now, our clubmen felt like traveling on clouds, as they careered along the great plateau west of the Black Hills, fully 8,000 feet above the level of the sea, though even there the grass was as green and fresh as if it grew in some sequestered valley of Pennsylvania. Again, in this untravelled world whose margin fades forever and forever as they moved, they would find themselves in an immense, tawny, treeless plain, outlined by mountains so distant as to resemble fantastic cloud piles. Here for days they would have to skirt the coasts of a lake, vast, unruffled, unrippled, apparently of metallic consistency, from whose sapphire depths rose pyramidal islands to a height of fully 3,000 feet above the surface. In a few days all would change. No more sand wastes, salt water flats, or clouds of blinding alkali dust. The traveler's road, at the foot of black precipitous cliffs, would wind along the brink of a roaring torrent, whose devious course would lead them into the heart of the Sierras, where misty peaks solemnly sentineled the nestling vales still smiling in genial summer verdure. Across these they were often whirled through immense forests of varied character, here dense enough to obscure the track, there swaying in the sweet sunlight and vocal with joyous birds of bright and gorgeous plumage. Then tropical vegetation would completely hide the trail, crystal lakes would obstruct it, cascades shooting down from perpendicular rocks would obliterate it, mountain passes barricaded by basaltic columns would render it uncertain, and on one occasion it was completely covered up by a fall of snow to a depth of more than 20 feet. But nothing could oppose serious delay to our travelers. Their motto was ever onward, and what they lost in 1 hour by some mishap they endeavored to recover on the next by redoubled speed. They felt that they would be no friends of barbicans if they were discouraged by impossibilities. Besides, what would have been real impossibilities at another time, several concurrent circumstances now rendered comparatively easy. The surveys, the gradings, the cuttings, and the other preliminary labors in the Great Pacific Railroad, gave them incalculable aid. Horses, help, carriages, provisions were always in abundance. Their object being well known, they had the best wishes of every hand on the road. People remained up for them all hours of the night, no matter at what station they were expected. The warmest and most comfortable of meals were always ready for them, for which no charge would be taken on any account. In Utah, a deputation of Mormons galloped alongside them for 40 miles to help them over some points of the road that had been often found difficult. The season was the finest known for many years. In short, as an old Californian said as he saw them shooting over the rickety bridge that crossed the Bear River at Corinne, they had everything in their favor, luck as well as pluck. The rate at which they performed this terrible ride across the continent and the progress they made each day, some readers may consider worthy of a few more items for the sake of future reference. Discarding the ordinary overland mail stage as altogether too slow for their purpose, they hired at Julesburg a strong, well-built carriage, large enough to hold them all comfortably, but this they had to replace twice before they came to their journey's end. Their team always consisted of the best 6 horses that could be found, and their driver was the famous Hank Monk of California, who, happening to be in Julesburg about that time, volunteered to see them safely landed in Cisco on the summit of the Sierra Nevada. They were enabled to change horses as near as possible every hour, by telegraphing ahead in the morning, during the day, and often far into the hours of night. Starting from Julesburg early in the morning of the 17th, their first resting place for a few hours at night was Granite Canyon, 20 miles west of Cheyenne, and just at the foot of the pass over the Black Hills. On the 18th, Nightfall found them entering St. Mary's, at the further end of the pass between Rattlesnake Hills and Elk Mountain. It was after 5 o'clock and already dark on the 19th, when the travelers, hurrying with all speed through the gloomy gorge of slate formation leading to the banks of the Green River, found the ford too deep to be ventured before morning. The 20th was a clear cold day very favorable for brisk locomotion, and the bright sun had not quite disappeared behind the Wasatch Mountains when the club men, having crossed the Bear River, began to leave the lofty plateau of the Rocky Mountains by the great inclined plane marked by the lines of the Echo and the Weber Rivers on their way to the valley of the Great American Desert. Quitting Castle Rock early on the morning of the 21st, they soon came in sight of the Great Salt Lake, along the northern shores of which they sped all day, taking shelter after nightfall at Terrace, in a miserable log cabin surrounded by piles of drifting sand. The 22d was a terrible day. The sand was blinding, the alkali dust choking. The ride for 5 or 6 hours was up considerable grade, still they had accomplished their 150 miles before resting for the night at Elko, even at this period a flourishing little village on the banks of the Humboldt. After another smothering ride on the 23d, they rested, at Winnemucca, another flourishing village, situated at the precise point in the desert where the little Humboldt joins Humboldt River, without, however, making the channel fuller or wider. The 24th was decidedly the hardest day, their course lying through the worst part of the terrible Nevada desert. But a glimpse of the Sierras looming in the western horizon gave them courage and strength enough to reach Wadsworth, at their foot, a little before midnight. Our travelers had now but one day's journey more to make before reaching the railroad at Cisco, but, this being a very steep ascent nearly all the way up, each mile cost almost twice as much time and exertion. At last, late in the evening of Christmas Day, amidst the most enthusiastic cheers of all the inhabitants of Cisco, who welcomed them with a splendid pine brand procession, Marston and his friends, thoroughly used up, feet swelled, limbs bruised, bones aching, stomachs seasick, eyes bleared, ears ringing, and brains on fire for want of rest, took their places in the state car waiting for them, and started without a moment's delay for Sacramento, about 100 miles distant. How delicious was the change to our poor travelers! Washed, refreshed, and lying at full length on luxurious sofas, their sensations, as the locomotive spun them down the ringing grooves of the steep Sierras, can be more easily imagined than described. They were all fast asleep when the train entered Sacramento, but the mayor and the other city authorities who had waited up to receive them, had them carried carefully, so as not to disturb their slumbers, on board the Yosemite, a fine steamer belonging to the California Navigation Company, which landed them safely at San Francisco about noon on the 26th, after accomplishing the extraordinary winter journey of 1,500 miles overland in little more than 9 days. Only about 200 miles being done by steam. 2:30 p.m. found our travelers bathed, dressed, shaved, dined, and ready to receive company in the grand parlor of the Occidental Hotel. Captain Bloomsbury was the first to call. Marston hobbled eagerly towards him and asked, "What have you done towards fishing them up, Captain?" "A good deal, Mr. Marston, indeed almost everything is ready." "Is that really the case, Captain?" asked all, very agreeably surprised. "Yes, gentlemen, I am most happy to state that I am quite in earnest." "Can we start tomorrow?" asked General Morgan. "We have not a moment to spare, you know." "We can start at noon tomorrow at latest," replied the captain, "if the foundry men do a little extra work tonight." "We must start this very day, Captain Bloomsbury," cried Marston resolutely. "Barbicane has been lying 2 weeks and 13 hours in the depths of the Pacific. If he is still alive, no thanks to Marston. He must by this time have given me up. The grappling irons must be got on board at once, Captain, and let us start this evening." At 4:30 that very evening, a shot from the fort and a lowering of the stars and stripes from its flagstaff saluted the Susquehanna, as she steamed proudly out of the Golden Gate at the lively rate of 15 knots an hour. Chapter 23. The club men go a-fishing. Captain Bloomsbury was perfectly right when he said that almost everything was ready for the commencement of the great work which the club men had to accomplish. Considering how much was required, this was certainly saying a great deal, but here also, as on many other occasions, fortune had singularly favored the club men. San Francisco Bay, as everybody knows, though one of the finest and safest harbors in the world, is not without some danger from hidden rocks. One of these in particular, the Anita Rock as it was called, lying right in mid-channel, had become so notorious for the wrecks of which it was the cause, that, after much time spent in the consideration of the subject, the authorities had at last determined to blow it up. This undertaking having been very satisfactorily accomplished by means of dynamite or giant powder, another improvement in the harbor had been also undertaken with great success. The wrecks of many vessels lay scattered here and there pretty numerously, some, like that of the Flying Dragon, in spots so shallow that they could be easily seen at low water, but others sunk at least 20 fathoms deep, like that of the Caroline, which had gone down in 1851, not far from Blossom Rock, with a treasure on board of 20,000 ounces of gold. The attempt to clear away these wrecks had also turned out very well. Even sufficient treasure had been recovered to repay all the expense, though the preparations for the purpose by the contractors, M. Gowan and Company, had been made on the most extensive scale, and in accordance with the latest improvements in the apparatus for submarine operations. Buoys, made of huge canvas sacks, coated with India rubber, and guarded by a network of strong cordage, had been manufactured and provided by the New York Submarine Company. These buoys, when inflated and working in pairs, had a lifting capacity of 30 tons a pair. Reservoirs of air, provided with powerful compression pumps, always accompanied the buoys. To attach the latter, in a collapsed condition, with strong chains to the sides of the vessels which were to be lifted, a diving apparatus was necessary. This also the New York Company had provided, and it was so perfect in its way that, by means of peculiar appliances of easy management, the diver could walk about on the bottom, take his own bearings, ascend to the surface at pleasure, and open his helmet without assistance. A few sets likewise of Rouquayrol and Dean Ayres's famous submarine armor had been provided. These would prove of invaluable advantage in all operations performed at great sea depths. As its distinctive feature, the regulator could maintain, what is not done by any other diving armor, a constant equality of pressure on the lungs between the external and the internal air. But perhaps the most useful article of all was a new form of diving bell called the Nautilus, a kind of submarine boat, capable of lateral as well as vertical movement at the will of its occupants. Constructed with double sides, the intervening chambers could be filled either with water or air according as descent or ascent was required. A proper supply of water enabled the machine to descend to depths impossible to be reached otherwise. This water could then be expelled by an ingenious contrivance, which, replacing it with air, enabled the diver to rise towards the surface as fast as he pleased. All these and many other portions of the submarine apparatus which had been employed that very year for clearing the channel, lifting the wrecks and recovering the treasure, lay now at San Francisco, unused fortunately on account of the season of the year, and therefore they could be readily obtained for the asking. They had even been generously offered to Captain Bloomsbury, who, in obedience to a telegram from Washington, had kept his crew busily employed for nearly 2 weeks night and day in transferring them all safely on board the Susquehanna. Marston was the first to make a careful inspection of every article intended for the operation. "Do you consider these boys powerful enough to lift the projectile, Captain?" he asked next morning, as the vessel was briskly heading southward, at a distance of 10 or 12 miles from the coast on their left. "You can easily calculate that problem yourself," Mr. Marston replied the captain. "It presents no difficulty. The projectile weighs about 20,000 pounds, or 10 tons. Correct. Well, a pair of these boys when inflated can raise a weight of 30 tons. So far so good. But how do you propose attaching them to the projectile?" "We simply let them descend in a state of collapse. The diver, going down with them, will have no difficulty in making a fast connection. As soon as they are inflated, the projectile will come up like a cork." "Can the divers readily reach such depths?" "That remains to be seen, Mr. Marston." "Captain," said Morgan, now joining the party, "you are a worthy member of our gun club. You have done wonders. Heaven grant it may not be all in vain. Who knows if our poor friends are still alive?" "Hush!" cried Marston quickly. "Have more sense than to ask such questions. Is Barbicane alive? Am I alive? They are all alive, I tell you, only we must be quick about reaching them before the air gives out. That's what's the matter. Air. Provisions, water, abundance. But air, oh! That's their weak point. Quick, Captain, quick, they're throwing the reel, I must see her rate." So saying, he hurried off to the stern, followed by General Morgan. Chief Engineer Murphy and the captain of the Susquehanna were thus left for a while together. These two men had a long talk on the object of their journey and the likelihood of anything satisfactory being accomplished. The man of the sea candidly acknowledged his apprehensions. He had done everything in his power towards collecting suitable machinery for fishing up the projectile, but he had done it all, he said, more as a matter of duty than because he believed that any good could result from it. In fact, he never expected to see the bold adventurers again, either living or dead. Murphy, who well understood not only what machinery was capable of effecting, but also what it would surely fail in, at first expressed the greatest confidence in the prosperous issue of the undertaking. But when he learned, as he now did for the first time, that the ocean bed on which the projectile was lying could be hardly less than 20,000 feet below the surface, he assumed a countenance as grave as the captain's, and at once confessed that, unless their usual luck stood by them, his poor friends had not the slightest possible chance of ever being fished up from the depths of the Pacific. The conversation maintained among the officers and the others on board the Susquehanna was pretty much of the same nature. It is almost needless to say that all heads, except Belfast's, whose scientific mind rejected the projectile theory with the most serene contempt, were filled with the same idea, all hearts throbbed with the same emotion. Wouldn't it be glorious to fish them up alive and well? What were they doing just now? Doing. Their bodies most probably were lying in a shapeless pile on the floor of the projectile, like a heap of clothes, the uppermost man being the last smothered, or perhaps floating about in the water inside the projectile, like dead goldfish in an aquarium, or perhaps burned to a cinder, like papers in a champion safe after a great fire, or, who knows? Perhaps at that very moment the poor fellows were making their last and almost superhuman struggles to burst their watery prison and ascend once more into the cheerful regions of light and air. Alas! How vain must such puny efforts prove! Plunged into ocean depths of 3 or 4 miles beneath the surface, subjected to an inconceivable pressure of millions and millions of tons of sea water, their metallic shroud was utterly unassailable from within, and utterly unapproachable from without. Early on the morning of the 29th of December, the captain, calculating from his log that they must now be very near the spot where they had witnessed the extraordinary phenomenon, the Susquehanna hove to. Having to wait till noon to find his exact position, he ordered the steamer to take a short circular course of a few hours' duration, in hope of sighting the buoy. But though at least 100 telescopes scanned the calm ocean breast for many miles in all directions, it was nowhere to be seen. Precisely at noon, aided by his officers and in the presence of Marston, Belfast, and the Gun Club Committee, the captain took his observations. After a moment or two of the most profound interest, it was a great gratification to all to learn that the Susquehanna was on the right parallel, and only about 15 miles west of the precise spot where the projectile had disappeared beneath the waves. The steamer started at once in the direction indicated, and a minute or two before 1 o'clock the captain said they were there. No sign of the boy could yet be seen in any direction. It had probably been drifted southward by the Mexican coast current which slowly glides along these shores from December to April. At last, cried Marston, with a sigh of great relief. "Shall we commence at once?" asked the captain. "Without losing the 20,000th part of a second," answered Marston. "Life or death depends upon our dispatch." The Susquehanna again hove to, and this time all possible precautions were taken to keep her in a state of perfect immobility, an operation easily accomplished in these Pacific latitudes, where cloud and wind and water are often as motionless as if all life had died out of the world. In fact, as the boats were quietly lowered, preparatory for beginning the operations, the mirror-like calmness of sea, sky, and ship so impressed the doctor, who was of a poetical turn of mind, that he could not help exclaiming to the little midshipman, who was standing nearest, "Coleridge realized, with variations, the breeze drops down, the sail drops down, all still as still can be. If we speak, it is only to break the silence of the sea. Still are the clouds, still are the shrouds, no life, no breath, no motion, idle are all as a painted ship upon a painted ocean." Chief Engineer Murphy now took command. Before letting down the boys, the first thing evidently to be done was to find out, if possible, the precise point where the projectile lay. For this purpose, the Nautilus was clearly the only part of the machinery that could be employed with advantage. Its chambers were accordingly soon filled with water, its air reservoirs were also soon completely charged, and the Nautilus itself, suspended by chains from the end of a yard, lay quietly on the ocean surface, its manhole on the top remaining open for the reception of those who were willing to encounter the dangers that awaited it in the fearful depths of the Pacific. Everyone looking on was well aware that, after a few hundred feet below the surface, the pressure would grow more enormous.